Hi, my name is Frank White and welcome to another one of my YouTube videos. Today I am going to talk about stops. Exactly what is a stop in photography? In photography, a stop is the exposure value plus twice the amount of light to increase the exposure value. One half the amount of light decreases the exposure value of stop. Fortunately, we can use the camera's internal metering to determine the proper exposure value, or you can always calculate the exact exposure value. So, a stop is the exposure value plus the difference of twice the amount of light or one half the amount of light. For example, if I have the correct exposure value with a shutter speed of 1 second, and I decrease the shutter speed to 1/2 second, then I'm letting in one half the amount of light. Hence, I've decreased the exposure value by one stop. If I increase the exposure value from 1 second to 2 seconds, then I am increasing the exposure value, and hence I've increased the exposure value by one complete stop. So because I'm letting in double the amount of light, if I have 1 second and I go to 2 seconds, that's double the amount of light. Now, we generally shoot in fractions of a second. So if I have a correct exposure value at a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second, and I change the shutter speed to 1/50th of a second, then I'm actually increasing the amount of light, because 1/50th of a second is a longer period of time than 1/100th of a second. Likewise, if I change the shutter speed to 1/200th of a second, then I'm decreasing my exposure value by a stop, because 1/200th of a second is a shorter duration of time than 1/100th of a second. In fact, 1/200th of a second is one half the amount of time of 1/100th of a second. So hopefully that kind of explains to you what a stop is. Now, don't confuse a stop with an f-stop. An f-stop works in a similar fashion, but it specifically works with the camera's aperture. I know you've heard the term f-stop, and a stop is different from an f-stop. A stop is a halving or doubling of light using any of your camera settings, your shutter speed, your aperture, or your ISO, whereas an f-stop works only with your aperture. Now, you can also change your exposure values a stop using flashes, but for the purpose of this video, I'm only going to talk about a stop with respect to using your camera settings. So an f-stop, also known as your aperture setting, or vice versa, works similar to a stop. For example, if I have a aperture setting, and this is my aperture, this little opening of say f5.6, and I want to let in twice the amount of light, then I'm going to open it up to f4. Now, I know that's counterintuitive, and I have to think about it as I do it, because it really is counterintuitive to me. But the higher an f-stop number is, then the smaller the opening, and the bigger an f-stop number is, the the bigger the f-stop number is, the smaller the opening, and the smaller an f-stop number is, the bigger the opening. so you can see how confusing that gets. But when you hear the term stop down, then they're actually closing up the aperture and increasing what's known as the depth of field. Okay, but that's the difference between a stop and an f-stop. Now, ISO. I can use the camera's ISO dial to change how sensitive the sensor is to light. So if I have an ISO of say 400 and I change my ISO to 200, excuse me, then the aperture becomes not as sensitive to light, and I've actually changed it a stop. Now, if my correct exposure value is correct with an ISO of say 400 and I change my ISO to 100, then I am changing the stop twice, or changing it by 2 stops, by making the sensor not as sensitive. And by doing so, I'm actually letting in 4 times the amount of light. Finally, the camera's ISO dial makes the camera either twice as sensitive to light or 1/2 as sensitive to light. Now, with most of these, you could have some incremental or 1/3 stops, but for the purpose of this video and to keep it simple, I'm not going to deal with fractions of a stop, just whole stops. So let's say you have an ISO of say 400 and you change the ISO to 200. Well, you've just made a change in a stop. You just change the stop by 1, and if you change it to ISO 100 with the correct exposure value of 400, then you've changed you made a 2-stop change, and so forth and so on. The other way, if the correct exposure is 400 and you changed it to 800, then you have increased it, decreased it a stop, increased it a stop. You made it more sensitive to light. And if you change it to, say, from 400 to 1600, then again, you are changing it by 2 stops. You've let in 4 times the amount of light. So if you want to see the math behind stops, then I would suggest that you watch Exposing Digital Photography. I think there are actually 12 courses that's on YouTube, and I do highly recommend those courses because it really goes into the ins and outs of photography, the math behind the numbers in photography. So I hope that I've been able to answer or provide you with some information about stops. And if you like this video, please let me know by giving me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, please take a moment to do so. If you have any comments, leave them below. I read each and every one of them. And finally, I'm going to leave you with this. If you're going to shoot anybody today, shoot them with a Canon or a camera of your choice. Thanks, guys.